I'm listening to this, so I sort of a question that Chinese will always ask when anyone talking about Christianity with them. So one of the first questions they would ask you is, oh, if God is real and so kind and so love, so merciful, why the Lord did not come to China, like for almost 2,000 years, right? So I think So
I think this is a question that was asked in history by people in Beijing that tried to prevent the diffusion of Jesuit teachings and things like that. This is the mystery of God, but we can say that maybe this text illustrates that Christianity came very early in China, which is, I think, for example, in Great Britain at the time, in Ireland, there were not many Christians, or in Germany, or in the United States, there was nothing about Christianity and so on. Then it's the mystery of God that came in a very small, remote place. That was Jerusalem, which was not Rome, and that chose little people, which is the Hebrew people, to convey his name, to make an alliance with Abraham, and then from these people to go all over the world. But apart from maybe the Hebrew people and the disciples of Jesus and so on, nobody can say that they were the first to receive the gospel. For example, I'm French. I think, maybe gospel spread quite early in my territory, but we stayed pagans for a very long time. I mean, which is even today, you will find some areas of French where Christianity didn't go very deep yet. And then I think in all the regions of the world, it took time for the missionaries and spreaders of the gospel to reach the place. But none of the countries today can say that they were the first to receive the gospel. I think that the first country or the first nation to convert was the Armenians, I think. Then there was a shift in the Roman Empire at the beginning of the 4th century, but it was quite late in the process. And Christianity came in China as early as 635, which is very early. So I don't know, this is the project of God. Maybe you can ask.
I think this is quite often like scholars' answers to questions like this, right? So God already came. And just a comment before that, I gave the floor to everyone. For me, it's because like early Christianity, I'm studying early Christianity. And when we're talking about Nestorianism, it's always like, oh, it's a heresy or it's not a heresy. So when you see from a Western perspective, right? So it's like kind of a sect has been kicked out of the church. But when you're looking at, so this amazing lecture is something get me to look at the picture globally. It's actually just as you said, right? So the divine providence, like it's how God like opened the door for the transmission of Christianity to the East. So through another kind of culture, because in the beginning the Christological controversy of these things it's a culture difference, it's a language difference, and then it's the same Christian faith but being carried on just through a different culture into another different culture, maybe a culture in between that can mingle so well in the text that we just read. So so for me it's very it's an amazing like way to see how God worked out in the world in history. Okay, so like I don't want to use too much time. So any question here from the audience or from online? So for those who participate online, so if you want to ask a question, you can also like text in the chat so we can read it.
Yes. So if my memory is correct, the text we have been reading a little bit tonight, you were mentioning that the Gospel of Matthew was part of the structure or of the biblical element that would be present in the text. Is it possible to say a little bit more of this presence of the Gospel of Matthew? And is there any other text from the New Testament, for example, Paul, is he present or not? And also of the First Testament of the Hebraic Bible. Can you say a little bit more about what would be the main key concept or text circulating or that you can spot in this set of books?
So in the manuscript which is here, which is the Tunting, we have 35 titles of books that were translated in Chinese. And among them, we can identify quite clearly some some Bible scriptures. The problem is that most of the manuscripts disappeared, and we don't have any of them. In the text themselves, you will find some what a scholar named Daniel Sheridan labeled micro-translations, which is punctually, you can say, okay, this is a quotation from the scriptures and so on. The biggest passage with the biblical content is in part of Yishen Lun, where you have a teaching that is presented at the teaching of Xu Jun, which is very, very close to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5 to 7. Nevertheless, you will find some pericopes of these two chapters that don't appear in the Chinese material. And then you will find some elaborations and descriptions of some of the pericopes that are quite far from the Gospel of Matthew as we have it. And so there's many possibilities that you will have a transmission of the Matthew Gospel that went through many different cultures and versions and that ended up like that. Another version is that it's a preaching, which is the preacher is remembering and following the order of the gospel that he certainly memorized and is adapting a bit his preaching to the addressees. It's a bit a question, but you can see that this big part follows the structure of Matthew, rejects some elements, and develops some other elements that are not in the gospel. Apart from this big passage, you will have some explicit quotations. For example, in the same manuscripts, you have a quotation from Isaiah, the suffering servant. But you don't have a book, an entire book of the scriptures that was translated in Chinese and that we have it today. Maybe one day there will be new discoveries, but it's not the case yet. You have many translations in Syriac and in Sogdian, discovered in Turfan, where you have the Psalter, a lot of Psalters, and you have also some Gospels material arranged for liturgy among the Hudra, which is the liturgical books of the Church of the East. So maybe one day we will know more.
I'm interested in the Anle Jing, the peace and joy. How did the Chinese, during the Tang Dynasty, this historian, first knocking at the door of China, this Jingjiao, how did they experience God's presence in terms of peace and joy? That through this process of, you mentioned that awareness of one's poverty, and then the process of purification, illumination, suffering, is a whole process of pruning that on the surface is the suffering as a meaningless, but how did they finally see this as with gratitude to experience God's presence in the presence of the Messiah, the presence of God? And you mentioned the Messiah. Could you elaborate a little further about this Anle Jing? This is my question. Yes.
So my own guess, I don't know what happened, which is we don't know who composed the text. We have it, and okay, we see that it's a very deep encounter between a Buddhistic view of the world and a Christian view of the world. We see that the aim of the spiritual path is to gain a kind of peace and joy or nirvana that is beyond death, that implies resurrection, that is described as another shore, or a healing perfume, or a liberation. Then my own direction of research is that it draws a lot from Isaac of Nineveh, or Isaac the Syrian, and in the thought of Isaac of Nineveh or Isaac of the Syrian, death is a pedagogical mean that God gives to human beings so that they become aware that they need the help and a kind of consolation coming from God. But that's at the beginning in Isaac of Nineveh, which is an uncommon theological position, is something good that God gives to humanity so that human beings realize that they are creatures and that they cannot gain their own salvation by their own. And so that they turn to God to be comforted, reconciled, to gain resurrection, and so on. And for him, the spiritual path and of mystical life is to confront to oneself, to his own imperfection, to be aware of everything that is imperfect in us, including, he says, depression, sin, mortality, and through that path, to confront oneself as a creature and to turn to God as the one who can help us to go beyond that. And I think this paved the way for the encounter with Buddhism, which is, it's a kind of answer to my view, which is, I don't know who wrote the text, but I think this is a monk that made this experience in that path, and then that understood very well what Buddhism teaches, which is impermanence, and that tried to bring God and the resurrection and the spiritual path and the Messiah as a kind of answer to that. So this is what I find very interesting in this text, which is a deep encounter, spiritual, personal, mystical, between common questions about mortality, about the sense of human life, about the search for happiness, about our own imperfections that exist in the Buddhistic tradition, that exist in the Christian tradition, that we all share, and that trying to find an answer that is common and that is proposed to anyone.
So we've got a question online here. Did the Syrian and Persian Christians migrate to China in a single movement, or did they have different historical origins?
So I think from the sources we can identify at least three different periods. I think there was a Sogdian period very early, especially in the western regions. In the beginning of the 7th century, it's sure, maybe earlier. We have a Persian wave of immigration, but more in the central plains, in Chang'an, Luoyang, and so on. And it's well documented in the middle of the 7th and then in the 8th century, following the Arabic conquest of Central Asia, especially. And then you have a Bactrian wave of immigration, which is the middle of the 9th century. What I try to advocate as a researcher is that it was a diverse community, which is Bactrian, Sogdian, Persian, foreigners had not the same kind of culture, and that you would find in the text the same kind of diversity and different theological sensibilities. I live in Hong Kong, for example. You have many different Christian denominations. If you go to the Catholic Church, you will find some Filipino communities alongside Americans, alongside British people, French people, alongside Hong Kong people from mainland China. I think they have a common Christian faith, but with different sensibilities, different theological approaches, features, and that was also the case at the time. I think there were some people with different backgrounds, even Chinese people, I guess, that shared common beliefs, but with different sensibilities.
Thank you, Alexis. You are right that we know very little about the evangelization of the East, besides what we know about India, which is a more important history. I don't know if I got your ideas right. Most of the texts are more to disseminate a doctrine or wisdom literature. In the Mogao caves, is anything about liturgy or liturgical text that tells that there was a community there, a living community doing some kind of Christian rituals? Yeah.
You have many material in Syriac that were discovered, especially in Turfan, in Tulufan, in a site named today Sipang or Buyalik, where you have many liturgical books in Syriac, in Sogdian, and I think most of the liturgical material was in Syriac. In the Mogao caves, you have this manuscript, the Pelio 3847, where you have the Gloria, or a Chinese version of the Gloria that shows that part of the liturgy was said in Chinese too. On the Xi'an Christian monuments, you have a part that describes the Christian community, where you have very clear references to the sacraments, to baptism, to the Eucharist, and to the unction for the death, to the sign of the cross, which is considered as a sacrament in the Church of the East. And you have very clear references to the fact that the Christian community was not uncommon, which is the text written in Chinese were, I think, more missionary and addressed to people who didn't have a very strong Christian background or were interested by the faith and so on. So they seem to us more about wisdom or less Christian as we know it. But I think that the Xi'an stele and then the Syriac and Sogdian material testify that the community was not uncommon or very strange in its belief and practices. That the common way to become Christian, to live in the church, to practice his faith was not very uncommon compared to what happened in Mesopotamia or in the West. And there was, to my view, the same kind of practices, community rights.
The Syriac, when you mentioned about Gloria, the Syriac liturgy always begins with both East and Western. Syriac liturgy begins with Gloria. Not just the Eucharist, but any prayer begins with the Gloria. So just interested to know that you have some material related to Gloria still retained there.
I would like to ask a personal question. What interests you most that you, as a French, and changed from the previous profession of engineering to study all this Christianity and also especially in the context of Chinese history?
So yes, I was an engineer in the past. I liked my job. I earned a lot more money than I earned. But then I had, let's say, an interest in theology, spirituality, and I wanted to understand more my human condition and the spiritual dimension of myself. And so I undertook some theological courses, philosophical courses, and then I made some biblical exegesis. And so I learned a lot of ancient languages, Hebrew, Syriac, Latin, Greek, and I liked a lot. And then I also had an interest in China. So I came to live in Hong Kong in 2019. And I studied Chinese text and Chinese history, and I liked very much, to the point that I wanted to continue to make a PhD. But then I was already 31, 32. So I had no chance to make an interesting PhD in Chinese studies only. So I think maybe I discovered this topic in a teaching in the University of Hong Kong. And what made me have an interest is that part of the texts are written in Syriac, which is one of the languages I learned for biblical exegesis. Part of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, and we don't know the Aramaic of the Bible so much. So the teaching I had in Rome was to study first Syriac, and then from the understanding of Syriac to understand biblical Aramaic. And so I had a knowledge of Syriac, and I was curious about, some text using some Chinese and also some Syriac. Maybe I can bring something to this field, which is, I realized that the field was a bit separated between Chinese scholars who understand Buddhistic and Taoistic and Confucian material very good, and then Christian scholars, mainly from the West, who have a strong background in Christian studies, but don't enter so much in Chinese studies. So with my own story, which is to have a deep training in theological studies and then in biblical material and then in Chinese studies, maybe I could try to enter in that field to learn more about Chinese religions. That was my goal. But also with bringing something which is a good understanding of the Christian faith and of Chinese materials to the field. So it was practical, which is I wanted to make a PhD. Then I was not a specialist of Buddhistic studies, but I wanted to study some Chinese material. So it was an easy way to find a field where I could use both and not be a total outsider. Yes, and I am very happy about that, which is that's something that I find very interesting in this field, is that you will encounter many different people with many different backgrounds. I'm very curious, so I like to discuss with people who have a strong background in Buddhistic studies and talk about the text, and I learn a lot from their standpoint. And I like to talk with people in early Christian studies, in Syriac material and so on, and I learn a lot from them. And I think doing that, knowing more both sides, we understand more and more this text. And so because I'm curious, I'm very happy about that. Then the difficulty is the future more, which is I'm in between two organized fields. So usually if you look for a job to teach, you have to enter in one of the two boxes. You have to be, if you make some Chinese studies, you have to study some Buddhistic or Taoistic material. If you make some early Christian studies, you have, for example, recently I asked the French government to be recognized as an assistant professor. So you have to enter in some boxes. So I asked for early Christian studies. Then they said, sorry, but we only take people for Latin and Greek. And sometimes we made some exceptions for Syriac, but Chinese, no. But well, it's early Christian material written in Chinese, so it's unusual, but it's like that. And then I went to the Department of Chinese Studies, and they say, yes, but how to say that? You're not supposed to study Christian material when you make some Chinese studies. so I don't enter in the boxes so well, but I like that. Usually we live in the, I think it's also the case in universities, but we live in this concept that Christianity comes from the West and is a Western import. In my text, it's not the case, which is the Church of the East had no relation or conflictual relation with the Roman Empire. There is still some Syriac Christians in the world, but they have not the Western culture. and then in China or in Chinese studies, you are not supposed, or it's supposed to be very marginal to study Christianity. But the text bridges those boundaries that exist in academic research today.
Yeah, so just a question regarding many of the texts we have seen, it borrowed terms or concepts from Buddhism. So did the Syriac Christians, I mean, this synthesis with Buddhism, were they successful in appealing, for example, to the local populace or in the imperial court? And was there any conflict later on, especially when Buddhism reached a peak in the Tang dynasty with Empress Wu Zetian and all those things? Was there any conflict among the Buddhists with the Syriac Christians? Yeah, so that's my question.
Yeah, we don't have some immediate sources for that, but we can see some techniques, for example, in the Qingxiao monument. For example, they will use some stories that are also in the Buddhist or Taoistic text, especially, for example, the coming back of the teaching of Lao Tzu. And one of the techniques is to say, well, the story says that Lao Tzu, because of the bad behaviors of the Zhou, he went and he fled in the West. And the story says that when the emperors will behave good and have the good behavior, the teaching of Lao Tzu will come back. We know that this story was used alternatively by Taoists and Buddhists to gain official recognition in China. This same kind of thing appears in the Qingxiao monument. So I think part of the strategy was to present Christianity as one kind of the teachings of the West, very similar to Buddhist teachings. We know that there were some periods where the emperor was more close to Buddhists, more close to Taoists, and there was a debate to know if Buddhism was accepted in China, was Chinese, and the process, it was the end of the 5th century process where Buddhism became Chinese. And I think Christians wanted to use that to gain some official recognition. How was it accepted? Certainly not very successful, because it left no trace after 845, at least in central China. You have some historical material where there is a Chinese author saying all the foreigners in China, so Christians, Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, if you gather all their temples in a place, you will find less temples than Buddhist pagodas or pagodas in a small village in China. So we don't know, which is you will find in secondary material people who are very optimistic, saying there were hundreds of temples in many places and so on. People who are very minimalistic, saying maybe there were 4 or 5 monasteries. There were some foreigners who practiced, maybe some Chinese converted, but it was very marginal from a historical point of view. I'm in between, which is we don't know so much. I don't think people will invest a lot in translating, in composing some texts if it's only for foreigners. For example, you find in Hong Kong there is the Orthodox Church. I think most of the texts there are in Russian, and they don't have the will, at least today, to translate in Chinese or in Cantonese. For example, if you go to Alopen in the north of China, you will find an Orthodox Church where you have many translations in Chinese, because part of the population was interested in that. So I think the fact that we have some Chinese texts says that it was not so marginal as we think, but then we don't have a register and so on. And the Chinese sources, they tend to, how to say, they don't understand these foreign things so well, especially in the later period, in the Song. You will find some names that are used for Mazdians or Zoroastrians that are applied to Manichaeans. You will find a very big word, which is Hu. What it designates exactly, is it Sogdian? Is it Zoroastrian? Is it Christian? Christianity was named Bositiao for long, which is the religion of Persia. Well, it's very strange because the official religion in Persia was supposed to be Mazdaism. So we don't know. We don't know. My hope is that we will have more and more discoveries and relics, and that the big picture will be more clear.
Thank you. I am half deaf, so probably it's because I didn't listen enough carefully. But I've noticed that you didn't use the word Nestorian. I'm sure that for an expert it's on purpose. And you mentioned also Christianity without reference to this Catholic Roman Western structure of the church. But I do remember to have read one book. Unfortunately, my memory is failing, but there were some delegations of a Nestorian bishop, let's say, or some people going from Central Asia to Rome, and they were first welcome. And after that, when it was discovered that, they may have some heretic or schismatic view, they were not so welcome. Anyway, there were no future. So my question is just to ask you, I'm sure that will help us or help me to understand why they don't use the word Nestorian. I don't say that the Nestorian are schismatic or heretic. I don't blame them for anything because I don't know much. But
I think the word came into disuse since at least 1996, where a very renowned scholar of the field named Sebastian Brock wrote an article whose title is Nestorian, What a Lamentable Misnomer. And in that article, he explains quite good that the word was used in the West, but never so well in the East, punctually, that Nestorius himself didn't know Syriac. He wrote in Greek, and that the Church of the East existed before Nestorius and had other referent theologians like Theodore of Mopsuestia, Babai the Great, and that Nestorius was never central to their theology. And that the word Nestorian came to be more and more used by heresiologists, especially following Justinian and the end of the 6th century, where the political framework was more tense. but that inside, among Christians themselves, the relations were actually quite good till at least the end of the 11th century, where there were some, the Byzantine Empire, let's say, had some more political views and so on. And then, for example, the episode you mentioned is about a Mongolian monk from the Church of the East, so from Syriac Christianity, who traveled to Europe and to Rome and was welcomed in Paris, in Rome, and so on. He received the communion from the Pope, for example. Even recently, I think even for the Roman Catholic Church, there was a common agreement with the Patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the West, which is the direct descendants of the Church of the East, that recognized that part of the misunderstanding was political, or was due to the fact that theological material was in Greek and Latin from a part, and in Syriac from another part, and that the words had not the same history. I think, so this is my personal point of view, I think part of the story is that the conciles in the West tried to defend Alexandrian theology and to save Cyrillus and to keep his formulations, even though the vocabulary changed. And that this rescue of the formulations of Cyrillus, who was quite a controversial personality from a personal man, was not followed by the Antiochian theologians and by the East, and that people who were not subject to an authority, a political authority, to harmonize the belief within the empire, like in the East, followed to have their theological standpoint, without that being problematic. If, how to say, you will find many critiques against Justinian's, for example, saying that he persecuted part of the Christians that didn't think like him, even though their theology was accepted after and before. And I think the word Nestorian was used in that period, and that entered through Epiphanius of Salamine to designate many people that didn't believe and practice like in the Byzantine Empire or in the Roman Empire in that time, but like the term Jew that was used to designate some heresies of Christianity, but that has no link with what we call today Jewish beliefs, like the word Arabian or Muslim. In heresiology books, you will find the designation of Jews to label some Gnostics, for example. So there is a rediscovery of, I think, the text of the Church of the East, of what I call the Church of the East, of what we called in the past Nestorians, in Syriac, in Arabic, that express a theology that is very close to what was practiced and believed at the same time. For example, I brought this book to make a bit of marketing for our new book series. So this is Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus of Lyon is from Syriac origin. He's living in Lyon in the second century. Then he describes so many Gnostic theological beliefs and so on. And he used the label word Gnostic. Since the rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, there is a distanciation with this word as used by Irenaeus, saying, well, what he describes is not exactly what people believed and practiced when we compare to the original manuscript of these people. I think the same kind of phenomena is at play today, which is when we study the text of the Church of the East, of theologians like Ephraim the Syrian or Babai the Great or John of Damascene who writes in Arabic and so on. It's quite close. The core of the faith is quite the same. Quite the same.
As we are running out of time, the last question, please.
Well, I would like to ask for elucidation of the term, if I pronounce well, Jingzhao. It's the Illuminist teaching. Is it only from one source we have this name, or what is also the content behind this term?
Yes.
Would you explain a little more?
So in the first Chinese sources, the name for Christianity is more Qing Jiao, which is the Qing, which means book or sutra or scripture. And then there is a shift in the sources where the name Da Qin is used from 745. And then for 5 of the texts we have, the character Qing is used, but with a very specific writing, which is normally there is Zhu, which is the sun, and then Qing on the bottom of the character. But then Zhu doesn't have the horizontal bar, and it's like Ko, which means the mouth or the. And so it's like a logo a bit for me, which is, you find this very specific character only in Christian material. I didn't see it elsewhere. The term, the character Qing, for example, in the Qingqiao monument, seems to designate everything that is Christian. Qingse, the Christian monasteries. Qingzhong, the Christians. So, and so on and so on. So I think it was used internally as a name for Christianity. Why this character was found, you will find many theories. Some people say because Manichaeism was very important at the time, especially after the Andalusian rebellion. People who helped the court to regain the power was the Uyghurs. And then the Uyghurs were Manichaeans at the time. And so Manichaeism was accepted and tolerated in China. And part of the package to support the court was to negotiate some Manichaean temples in China. And one of the names for Manichaeans was Mingjiao. It's used in the Song more later, but it was maybe used also in the Tang period. Ming is also meaning luminous or light. It's another character. So we'll find some scholars who try to advocate for that. We'll find some scholars who will find to advocate for the meaning of Qing, which is without the horizontal bar. It can mean the light word, which is Ko, is also an equivalent of Yen, the word of or the speech. So there was a kind of theological elaboration on that. One of the significations is auspicious. I don't know, but it's clear that with this orthography or with this representation of the character, it was like a logo to name Christianity. And it was used by the Christian text and the Christian authors, and not by the Tang Chinese official documents. Why it was chosen, I don't know so much, but I can indicate if you have interest in that, I can refer you some publications about that. I disagree with the view. You will find some scholars who say it's just a variant, which is in Tang Chinese. Usually people who write, they use many variants, and you have many variants for the same character. But this variant, I studied some Dunhuang material a lot, and it's still one of the aspects of my research. I didn't see this variant of character outside of a Christian manuscript. So I think it was intended. It was intended.
Do you think that if Matteo Ricci, Michele Ruggieri were knowledgeable about the original text and Jingjiao, would they have chosen this term over Tianzhu Jiao?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
It's just a speculation because, yes,
you will find so many stories about Tianzhu. How did they find that? So there is the story of the altar, and it's written on the altar, and it's conflicting in secondary bibliography. You will find also many, for example, Jean Basset, which was a French theologian living in Chengdu, who made one of the first translations of the Gospels and the Epistles. He didn't like Tianzhu. He used Xuan, that then passed in the Christian translations from Morrison, because Morrison had access to one of the translations of Jean Basset that was in the Oxford Library, I think. So I think that there was many variations in the vocabulary during the first periods of the 16th, 17th, even the beginnings of the 18th century. Then it was imposed in 1715, I think, by the Pope to use Tianzhu. But there was a controversy and a great variability in the vocabulary before that.
Mm-hmm.
So what would I have chosen? I'm not sure.
Yes. Excellent talk and wonderful sharing. We could continue this wonderful discussion. We still can continue our discussion because soon after you are invited to go downstairs. There will be a little, not a reception, but a little snack for you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Alexis Balmont. We wish you all the best and continuation of this inspiring publication and research. Is so much needed about the origins of Christianity in China. Thank you also, Dr. Song Jianxia, for chairing this meeting, our team, and all of you who joined us online and on site. Thank you very much and have a good evening.